Something that I'm sure is going to be part of that future of food systems research and policy action is innovation. And also understanding how can we bring innovations that we've tried at a small scale and that have worked at a small scale to a large scale where they can really begin to impact and shape the lives of large numbers of people in the global majority. And that's going to be the subject of our next session, which is about scaling post-Farmgate innovations to support healthy diets. So to introduce that session and the different participants, I'd like to hand over to Shabani Ghosh from Tufts University and the Feed the Future Food Systems for Nutrition Innovation Lab.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the session on scaling post-Farmgate innovations. I'd like to ask Patrick Webb, who is the co-conspirator and co-moderator of this session, to please come up. And we have quite a large group of people who won't fit on this stage, so I'm going to just ask our three speakers, Jocelyn Boito, Giacomo Zanello, and Saveda Liverpool-Tassi, to please join us on the stage. So this was an interesting session to plan, and we really were trying to bring together research that is being conducted on food systems, particularly with an emphasis on healthy diets, but from the post-Farmgate perspective. So anything post-production up to the point of the consumer is what the interest of the Food Systems for Nutrition Innovation Lab is. So today's group of panelists will present research that will be assessing or examining the potential for the scaling up of innovations across the value chain. And the focus is obviously nutrient-dense foods, and identify priority information needs and ways forward. Presentations will focus on linking quality to quantity within the context of food loss and waste, understanding the barriers for innovation diffusion and opportunities for ensuring that we have an inclusive food system via MSME innovations in the midstream of Africa's supply chain. As I've already introduced Patrick, I'd like to also take this opportunity to introduce our panelists, as well as two of my colleagues from USAID who will be joining for opening and closing remarks. So first of all is Megan Anson. Megan Anson is a senior nutrition advisor with the USAID Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, and is an expert in the design, management, and monitoring and evaluation of activities that deliver safe and nutritious foods to the food system. Megan has an MA in International Studies and Humanitarian Assistance, and she also has a certificate on International Nutrition, Delivery Science for International Nutrition from Tufts. We'll have closing remarks from Ahmed Kablan, who is a Senior Science Advisor for the Center for Nutrition within the Food Safety Division at the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. And Ahmed has been very, very active in the space around food loss and waste, as well as on climate change. I don't think I can do justice to Ahmed's CV here, so I will ask if you are interested in hearing Ahmed's work around the food loss and waste community of practice, as well as his work around the USG climate change, food systems, nutrition security. Please do reach out to him. In terms of our speakers, Jocelyn Boito, who's going to be the first speaker, she's a postdoctoral associate at the Tata Cornell Institute for Agriculture and Nutrition, and she earned her PhD in International Nutrition in 2021 from Cornell University. She will be followed by Giacomo Zanello, who is an associate professor in food economics and health. He leads the Agri-Food Economics and Marketing Department and is the Deputy Director of the Graduate Institute for International Development, Agriculture and Economics at the University of Reading. And finally, we will be joined by Saveda Liverpool-Tassi, who is a Michigan State University Foundation Professor in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics. And her research focuses on emergent issues related to smallholder productivity and welfare with dynamic and transforming food markets in sub-Saharan Africa, alongside poorly functioning markets in the region. Saveda has received her PhD in Agriculture and Consumer Economics from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And I'm sure I'm not doing justice to any of our speakers as well as our colleagues from USAID, but given the time, I would like to ask Megan Anson to come up and give us some opening remarks. Thank you.
Are we on? Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Shabani. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to frame our session today with the scope of the challenge that we are all facing in food systems. We know that food systems are failing to deliver safe, affordable, and nutritious diets, and that the risks to nutrition and diets are only increasing. For example, the climate crisis is threatening the systems that households rely on to nourish their families. And conflict is exacerbating poverty, hunger, and malnutrition worldwide. The statistics I'm going to share probably aren't new to many of you in this room, but they are compelling. 3.1 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. This is even worse in low-income countries where 88% of the population cannot afford a healthy diet. Poor diets contribute to 11 million deaths annually and are a leading cause of mortality worldwide. And last but not least, but the vast majority of young children in low-income countries receive insufficient diets. While we've seen little progress in improving food systems and diets over the last decade, and we know that they are a significant obstacle to human growth, development, and productivity, there is a global recognition of the importance of working across food systems for broader sustainable change. To achieve healthy diets, there is an urgent need to focus on innovations, technologies, policies, private sector engagement, and applied science so that governments and other key stakeholders can cost-effectively scale up actions across the food system and do that effectively. And that's why we're all here today with this panel. There's also a need to examine and understand what types of innovations are likely to succeed post-Farmgate in low and middle income countries, how to understand the market system, make it fit for purpose, and the policy and enabling environment requirements in order to do so. I hope that this session today facilitates a discussion that will generate an even greater understanding of the research and policy needs needed to support innovation for healthy diets and a healthy planet. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I hand it over to Patrick to say a few words, I just want to give a little bit of the order. We're going to have Patrick speak about a little bit about the Food Systems Nutrition Innovation Lab, and then we will be followed by the three speakers. So just to avoid any breaks, I'm just going to ask the speakers if they could just hand off to the mic to the next person. Each speaker is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and what we want to do is leave plenty of time for a discussion. There is, for the speakers, there is a clicker that's sitting right there that should allow you to change the slides. So I think if there's anything else housekeeping-wise, I will chime in. But over to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Shubhani, and I'll keep this short. Wonderful to see everyone here, and hello to everyone online. I'm Patrick Webb. We are both faculty at Tufts University, but we're leading this innovation lab. It's part of the Feed the Future initiative of the US government. We're funded by USAID. There are other innovation labs, many that focus on things like new seeds and germplasm and productivity on the farm. We have food systems and nutrition in our name. So we are looking very broadly at the entire gamut of stakeholders and actors and processes across the food systems, aiming to try and make more healthy, sustainable, safe foods available to everyone. So we're very focused on the value chain. We're focused on all the things that have to happen between the farm and the people consuming food in terms of food safety, cutting food loss and waste, improving the affordability of various nutrient-rich foods by improved storage, improved drying, improved delivery. Right? So to riff on the Ministry of Agriculture person who was here yesterday for the repurposing subsidies side event, he said for change to happen, any change to happen, three things need to go hand in hand. And he said they are technical, economic, and he used the word political, but that includes governance, right? The enabling environment. And that applies to everything that we do in our innovation lab, and those are the things you're going to be hearing. Technical, we need innovations, things, practices, policies. We also need to be able to measure what's happening in terms of those innovations and the impact. We need things to be profitable. We need to understand the cost and the benefit of change and of actions and innovations. And that requires us to understand the opportunities and constraints of everyone in that middle of the value chain, the small and medium enterprises in particular, who play such an important role. But you also need appropriate governance. You need the institutions and the policy framework to allow for things to work. And that's what we're going to be hearing about today, those three important dimensions, and hoping to have a great discussion. So to begin with, I'll hand over to Jocelyn.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for this invitation to join the discussion. This morning, I'll be talking about linking quality to quantity in the context of measuring food loss and waste of perishable foods. So just to start, food loss and waste is part of the Sustainable Development Goals under Target 12.3. And this aims to reduce food waste at the retail and consumer levels by half, and then to broadly reduce food losses along production and supply chains. So addressing these food loss and waste issues requires a lot of things, but my top three would be first, harmonizing a food loss and waste definition. And this is really to set a common understanding among stakeholders of what exactly we're talking about and referring to when we say food loss and waste. The second is using measurement approaches that are appropriate for different objectives, commodities, and value chain stages along different food system contexts. And this all leads to generating sufficient evidence to identify these critical loss points, causes of loss, and also considering and evaluating different management strategies. So starting with the definition, this is where the challenge just begins. Unfortunately, there's no harmonized food loss and waste definition. Often, food loss and waste definitions are rooted in an objective or perspective that's taken. And so we end up with this whole group of some overlapping, some really different conceptions of what food loss and waste actually is. So this creates a challenge in terms of understanding what is actually being discussed, what the data reflect, and how we can compare and aggregate food loss and waste estimates across different commodities and value chain stages. So we looked at, we wanted to understand what are different definitions that are used, and we used an existing definitional framework that identified definitional elements that are along the left-hand side. And we first considered a definition that was proposed in 2014 by FAO's Global Initiative for Food Loss and Waste Reduction. And so this was meant as to be a harmonized, globally applicable food loss and waste definition. And so we see that food loss and waste kind of is considered at the point where food is ready for harvest or slaughter, so at this pre-harvest stage. And it follows along the food supply chain of food that is intended for human consumption. And the stages include farm all the way to consumer, and any food that is diverted away from the supply chain towards non-food uses is considered food loss and waste. And the types of food loss could be quantitative, but also qualitative, so considering different quality aspects of food. So we next looked at, okay, what are the sources of the data and what definitions are they using? So we look at the FAO Food Loss and Waste Database, and there are many, many sources of data, but a lot of the bulk of the data come from these three sources reflecting food loss and waste of different commodities in Africa, the US, and India. And what we find when we compare it to the FAO 2014 definition is that there's fairly decent alignment, particularly with regard to the scope, the stages included, and the criterion. We then take the next step to say, okay, with regard to the SDG and the SDG 12.3 indicators, how does this align? And so when we look at the definitional elements across the food loss index and the food waste index, and we compare them to FAO 2014 definition, we see that there's really not much alignment across all of the definitional elements. For the sake of time, I won't go through each of them, but I will point out, in particular with regard to utilization, the SDG 12.3 indicators have a narrower scope in that any food that's diverted to a non-food, non-productive use is counted as food loss and waste, whereas these other definitions are more broad, where it's any non-food use, regardless of its productivity, is considered food loss and waste. So we next move to measurement, and there are data gaps and different needs here as well. So for the most part, a lot of the estimates that we have for food loss and waste are based on these quantitative food loss and waste estimates. So we're talking about different loss of mass or volume of food. These can be converted into figures of value or calories or different nutrients, but essentially it's all ties back to the mass or volume of food that's lost. The figure on the right just demonstrates the amount of data on quantitative food loss and waste, and it's really heavy on cereals and pulses. So we need to fill data gaps for these perishable foods and across different value chain stages. This becomes very challenging, particularly for perishables, because the timing of value chains is quite short. So for fresh perishables, it's usually about days to weeks that foods are moving from farm to consumers, whereas more durable products are moving from weeks to months. So there's kind of a wider range where you can collect data. We also need to standardize methods for improved data quality and reporting. There have been a number of methodological resources out there to standardize the standardized food loss and waste measurement, primarily focusing on quantitative food loss and waste, and some have integrated the qualitative food loss and waste as well. But more work is needed with regard to both the food quality aspects and also estimating qualitative food loss and waste. So the figure on the right is, again, just to demonstrate that studies looking at qualitative food loss and waste really lag behind studies that look at the quantitative food loss and waste across different food quantities and regional contexts. The extra challenge with food quality is that it's a really broad area. So we can think food quality, there's so many different attributes. And so we really need to understand what are the important quality attributes in a specific value chain that we should focus on. And that also includes identifying the formal and informal quality assessment approaches that are taken. So as food moves along the value chain actors are making different decisions based on their assessment of the food quality that relates to how they handle food loss and waste. And this all ties into identifying food loss and waste pathways and how the quantitative and qualitative food loss and waste are connected and related. So I'll just briefly share an example from our work in South India on tomato value chains. So this is fresh tomato value chains. And we used pilot sort discussions with farmers to understand their perceptions on tomato quality attributes, destinations, and marketability. Because market grades tend to seem neatly packaged, but what kind of goes into the decision making on grading and sorting those into those categories. So the photo on the bottom just kind of illustrates what this looks like. We're giving farmers freshly harvested tomatoes and asking them effectively to grade and sort them and have a discussion afterwards. So our findings are presented in the heat map above. So starting with the top heat map that looks at quality attributes, we find that there are many, but not necessarily the same attributes that are considered for each grade. So it's not just, farmers aren't just looking at a single type of or a handful of attributes and going down and grading all the tomatoes. They're looking at different attributes for first quality that they might look at, and then a different set of attributes perhaps for the lower quality tomatoes. When we look at the destinations and use of tomatoes, any market grade can be used as food, and also any market grade can become food loss and waste. Of course, there's a trend where the better quality tomatoes are more likely to be sold as fresh in the fresh food market, and then it sort of, as you go down in terms of quality, it goes towards processed, and then food loss and waste would be animal feed and discarded as trash. And this is linked with acceptable quality limits in the market that can change. So when we asked about marketability of these different market grades, we see that, for first quality, most of the time they can always sell them. But as you move down in terms of the types of tomato quality, there's sometimes that farmers can sell them, sometimes that they can't. And so this gave us an idea of, just how complicated quality can be when we're just thinking of these, 5 different market grades in a fresh perishable food value chain. And this is just, starting with the farmers. This type of exercise is quite difficult as you move along the value chain with doing it with different value chain actors, just because of the spatial needs required. Okay, so I'll just quickly wrap up. Some of the key takeaways are that a harmonized definition is important for data collection, transparency, and sharing to inform food loss and waste reduction targets and policies. Applying standardized measurement and reporting methods to more diverse sets of commodities, particularly perishable foods and value chain stages, can be used to improve the primary data quality, and that feeds into estimation approaches that often use secondary data. And then lastly, evaluating quality attributes and acceptable quality limits is challenging, but it's really necessary to understand these different food loss and waste pathways, particularly for perishable foods, because the quality is sensitive to time, temperature, and handling as it moves along the value chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Please keep questions till the end. We'll have the 3 presentations and then we'll do Q&A after that. So over to Giacomo.
Okay, good morning, everyone. What I'm going to do today in this short contribution, I will focus in three points that I hope can help the discussion we are going to do in terms of innovation and innovation in the field of food loss and waste. I will first talk about the nature of the economy in many low and middle income countries and how informal sector that is developed along a formal sector have an implication of innovation creation, but also innovation adoption. I want then to focus in providing a snapshot of what innovation is when we talk in food loss and waste sector. I'm going to use some data that was collected by the Food System for Nutrition Innovation Lab last year, and it gives a little bit of flavor of the nature of the innovation. I will conclude with a final point in which I'm going to talk about what are the barriers for innovation within countries and to countries. And I will try to give a little bit of snapshot of what might be the major factors that we might want to consider when we talk about the diffusion of innovation. So in many low and middle income countries, we see 2 sectors in the economy that are developing alongside. We have a formal sector, and we see the picture here on the left-hand side, and we have an informal sector, which is represented by the picture here on the right-hand side. And the recognition of those 2 sectors in the same economy, it's an important factor when we talk about how innovation is created and how innovation is adopted. On the left-hand side, formal firms, formal sector, might have certain way in which they have exposure to innovation and to create innovation. But I want to focus a little bit on the photos on the right-hand side, which is the informal sector. Informal sector that in many low and middle income countries is up to 30 or 40% of the total economies. Those are informal, so are mainly small and medium enterprises that have not been registered. And as you can see, the way in which they work is very different than how they work in the formal, often in the formal sector. The point I really want to make out of this, and I think is the important reflection when we talk about innovation, is that the recognition of the informal sector provide opportunities to look at where innovation can born and trying to mitigate the constraint in the diffusion of innovation. In the informal sector, innovation borns out of constraints. Innovative businessmen in the informal sector are people that with their ingenuity they innovate, they often repurpose certain materials to build in different materials, and it's very much an innovation for surviving, but also is a very, very rich environment for innovation. I'm gonna come back to this a little bit later when I'm trying to summarize a little bit the main point. But it's very important is recognition of the two sectors in the same economy when we talk about innovation. The second point I want to make, is about the nature of innovation that we find in the food and loss sector. And to do that, I'm going to use some data that was collected last year. This was a large initiative looking at literature, looking at grey literature, and looking at report of all sort of innovation that have been documented with some idea whether they will have potential for to be scalable and to be profitable. I'm going to give you a little bit a snapshot of what this exercise found in terms of the food loss and waste sector. So before starting, let me just remind ourselves when we talk about innovation, what we are talking about. And I think a main point that I wanted to share is that when we talk about innovation, we don't talk only about technologies. Actually, there is all sort of innovative way of doing things that could be processes, could be product, and go well beyond technologies. In this exercise, all the innovation that have been found in Malawi with this potential for scalability and profitability, we see that most of them are product. So new product that have been developed that could be could improve, mitigate the food loss and waste in the agribusiness. Then we have processes and practices, which are a little bit smaller in number. Now we can go a little bit, we can do a step a little bit further, and we can see how those relate with key characteristics of the product, whether they improve the nutrition of the product, whether they address food safety, or whether they actually address food loss and waste directly. And we see how the product are clearly innovation that address nutrition, nutrient dense and food loss and waste tend to be across the different typologies of innovation, the major one with a similar share on that. We can also look at how those innovations have been developed for specific product. And we see in terms of nutrient-rich food, how fish, dairy, and fruit and vegetable are the products that have been part of those innovations to a large extent. So this is a little bit a snapshot of the nature of innovation in the value chain in Malawi. More information can be found in the main papers. My last point is very much about when we talk about innovation, we have a product, but often having a product is not the most challenging part. The most challenging part is having people using innovation. And this is what I want to talk about, which is how innovation can diffuse both in countries, but also to countries. And somehow we find different factors from literature that have been found as an important determinants for the diffusion of innovation within countries. And all of those determine this enabling environment that is key for the diffusion of innovation. Something that I wanted to mention here, and sometime is maybe not recognized as much as possible, is how the characteristics of the entrepreneur are important characteristics. So we see how entrepreneurs that are willing to take some risk, entrepreneurs that are more proactive, entrepreneurs that as well are that acumen, that grit as well of succeed, have important characteristics for the adoption of innovation. And this is important when we talk about surviving. So we have seen the informal sector, and an opportunity is very much trying to see how we can support the informal sector in a way that innovation can be adopted in that sector, but also can be found and then shared across the sector. Innovation to low and middle income countries, instead, we are talking about how the countries can open up and can be more receiving of different innovation. And again, the personal and the entrepreneurial traits of the businessmen are important factors. So those are the 3 points I wanted to mention, and during the discussion we can build on those. And let me finish with a little bit some takeaway messages. The first one is about the recognition of all the innovation that is what we call under the radar. So innovation that sometimes it doesn't go into publication because it's been developed in a very small scale. Nevertheless, it can be very important for the small firms that are actually adopting them. Often we find the term of frugal innovation to reflect this sort of innovation. The second point I wanted to remind ourselves is that innovation is not just technology. There are a lot of innovation in the way in which people can do things that are nevertheless very important and often are easier to adopt because the financial requirement tend to be sometimes lower, as much as the skills required to adopt them. And finally, I wanted to mention this concept of bundle of innovation, and this is something that emerged also from the publication that I mentioned earlier, which is this idea that there is not a silver bullet, and often is a combination of different innovation that can be adopted by a larger range of entrepreneurs in this case, which can together improve scalability and profitability. So often those might tend to be learning-based innovation. And also there is this emphasis, again, as I mentioned earlier, about not just technological innovation, but also non-technological innovation that are an important part for the development of agri-food value chain. So thank you so much for your attention, and I pass to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Giacomo. We have Soeda. I would just point out that those reports, the 4 scoping reports, are available on the Food Systems Nutrition, not for, Food Systems Nutrition, one word, .org, which is our website, and you can see the details then of what innovations, moisture meters, drying systems, cool chambers, and so on, that we are talking about. Over to you, Soeda.
Thank you, Patrick. So good morning, everyone. And it's really great to be here and to have the opportunity to share some of these thoughts. In my 10 minutes or so, I'm going to try to talk about the role of these MSMEs in the midstream and downstream of food supply chains in promoting inclusive value chains to increase the availability of affordable, safe, and nutritious foods. So I want to start with an observation, right? So I've been working in this space for over a decade, and I found out that in a lot of the conversations that I have with academics, with policymakers, with donors, and development practitioners more generally, there seems to be more of a focus on trying to understand or design programs to prove and test if new innovations, often external innovations that are considered modern, are working. But what I find that tends to be often overlooked, and I think is a missed opportunity, is rigorous research that actually shows what is already happening and where and why, and then tries to understand how that can be used to make value chains or the food system to work even better. So what I'm going to do is just use an example from micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises operating in the midstream and downstream of food supply chains in developing countries. And I'm going to do that by making 4 points about these MSMEs, some of which have been mentioned already. And then I'm going to also then draw on some examples from ongoing research that colleagues and I are involved in. So the first point I want to make about these micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises is that they are already a key source of employment for many in developing regions. So we've observed over the last couple of decades that in response to changing consumption patterns driven by increases in income, urbanization, there's been a rapid expansion within domestic economies of supply chains around provision of these foods that are being increasingly demanded, things like fruits and vegetables, animal protein source foods, dairy, etc. And in a study that was done by Dulles-Lager et al., they actually looked at the amount of time spent by people in rural households and urban households, and they found that the agri-food system post-production accounts for a significant amount of time and is an important source of livelihood to many. In sub-Saharan Africa, in rural areas, agri-food system employment, this is actually small-scale processing, transportation, logistics within the food system, accounts for about 25% of full-time equivalents. In urban areas, it's about 30%. In Asia and Latin America, also it's over 20%. Another important dimension or characteristic of a lot of these MSMEs is that they're actually a key source of livelihood for many women and for low-income households, particularly in things like small-scale processing or commercial activities, because those ones have lower barriers to entry. The second point I want to make, as made also today, is the important role that these MSMEs play in determining the quality and the safety of the food that's available to consumers. And a lot of time, this is determined by the handling practices of these micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises. And there are many factors for this. Some of it has to do with their own individual technical capacity, but a lot of times there are two important factors for this. One is the existence of effective demand for the safe or high-quality food, but then also is the existence of standards and or regulations. And we know that many times this is a big challenge in many developing regions, and oftentimes in the wet markets or the sector, the informal, more informal sector that many of these MSMEs operate in. A third point I want to make about these MSMEs is the important role that they can play in providing or improving the welfare of small-scale farmers or producers in developing regions. And for this, I'm going to be drawing from a scoping review that was done a couple of years ago, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, looking at the role that was played between small-scale producers and value chain actors in the midstream and downstream of input and output supply chains. So we're talking about the processors, the retailers, the wholesalers, the restaurants, and the interaction between small-scale producers and these actors. And what we found in that was two very important points. One is obvious, which is the fact that as these subsectors are expanding and there's processing happening, more demand for fruits and vegetables, there's an opportunity for farmers to sell their products. So there's a market. But the other point that we found that was extremely important and also necessary for this interaction between the small-scale producers and these value chain actors to be positive was the existence of the provision of support services. So many times these SMEs, not using contracts, but in the absence of contracts, were providing these small-scale producers a suite of support services that then made it attractive or economically profitable for the small-scale producers to adopt certain kinds of technologies or innovations, or to just improve their productivity because maybe they were trained. So imagine an agro-input dealer who is selling and also training, or a processor who's buying from the farmers but is also providing the logistics to reduce the transportation costs for the farmer getting his product to the agro-processor. And then the last point I want to make links very closely to what Giacomo just mentioned. The important role that many of these MSMEs play in innovation. They are actually innovators, and as he said, they might be innovating out of a constraint, but sometimes they're innovating also in a way to improve on their operations and their profitability. But the way they innovate is often very important if we're trying to think about how to make value chains much more inclusive, particularly because of the constituents within who they work with and who they interact. Some of the characteristics of their innovations are, one, many of their innovations are organically developed, right? As Wakemo said, coming out of some constraints that they're facing. So they know these market failures and they understand it very well because they are operating in this space and operating in the absence of an NGO or government support and just operating within the real context that they're going to likely exist after the government program has expanded or after the NGO project has left. Another characteristic is that many times these MSMEs, they are profit-driven. They have a lot of constraints, there's no doubt. Technical capacity, their financial access, the business environment in which they operate is often very challenging. But given all of those, they are still doing the best that they can with the limited resources and are often efficient in their own way. And thus the innovations that they are introducing or that they are part of are more likely to be sustainable and continue after a one-time intervention has left. Another characteristic of a lot of these MSMEs is that they're closer to our target population, if it's the poor households, either in rural or urban areas, or if we're interested in women or youth. They're usually closer to them, both geographically and socially. And that can actually allow for the sustaining of these informal interactions or repeated interactions in the absence of contracts. It can also reduce the risk of default as well in those interactions. And then finally is that these MSMEs are often willing to partner with researchers to understand how to improve on what they're doing. And I think that this is an opportunity that hasn't been taken advantage of enough. They're interested, particularly if you're coming to provide them a way to demonstrate that what they're doing, the innovations that they're using actually work, and then they can use it to advocate for more resources. Or if they're trying to make a tweak to something that they're doing and they want to know, would this work? Or is what I'm doing actually working? What is working or not working? And I've actually had experience of quite a number of these MSMEs that we've been able to collaborate with and has enabled us to learn a lot that I think we wouldn't have learned otherwise. So I want to provide quickly just two examples from ongoing research that we have in Nigeria that links to this. And one of them is what I would call ag value chain development companies or one-stop shop. And these are SMEs usually that are providing multiple services to farmers. And they include providing farmers an access to an output market, so somewhere that the farmers can sell, but also providing them with inputs and oftentimes training. And then these one-stop shop enterprises have rapidly expanded in Nigeria and other African countries. And what are some of the advantages of these kinds of SMEs? Well, on one hand, they provide input dealers like the agro dealers, chemical suppliers, or fertilizer suppliers access to a stable market for their product. Many times they're working with farmers in a group, and then they're training the farmers, they're providing them the inputs. They can serve as a guarantor to the input supplier that if you sell through me to my farmers, then you're definitely going to get your payment at the end of the season. I'm going to buy from the farmers. And then they're also able to provide the agro-processors who they are supplying. So many times, like this one that we're working with is connected to the brewery sector. And so they're able to provide the brewery sector and other market channels the quantity and quality of the inputs that they need for their processing plant. So it's sort of a win-win situation. So what is the potential here? The potential here is for us to understand how this kind of one-stop shop work, and then possibility of expanding them across the country or across different regions of the country or regions of Africa. But the other potential is understanding whether these actors that already have these networks and already have this way of interacting with these small-scale producers could be a mechanism for changing the behavior of those small-scale producers in different ways, maybe adopting new innovations or adopting climate-smart practices and things like that. So one is understanding what they're doing, and then also how it can be used to promote new things. A second example that I want to provide is one that we're actually currently just collected our baseline data. We're working on a randomized control trial with a private enterprise that is a rental service provider for tomatoes in northern Nigeria. So basically, this is a small firm, and they rent plastic crates to vegetable farmers and traders, but then also provide those farmers and traders a suite of other services. So this is very important because the plastic crates have been demonstrated to reduce the loss for tomatoes when you're moving the tomato from one location to the other, which is particularly important in Nigeria because majority of the production of tomatoes happens in the north, and then the large market for tomatoes is actually in the south, sometimes a distance of 1,000 kilometers. So you have this product moving, and so it has been demonstrated that you can reduce the post-harvest loss in transportation by using these plastic crates. But the adoption of these crates is generally low. And so what they do is that they provide farmers or traders the opportunity to rent those crates, And then they also can link them up to markets in the south. So they have agents in a lot of the wholesale markets in the south, southwest, southeast, and south-south. And if a farmer comes to rent from them, they can also link them up to these agents. They advise them sometimes on where to send. So if they come and you say you want to send your product to Lagos, and Lagos is going to take your product 1 or 2 days, well, this is what has happened. In Mile 12 market in Lagos, there's been abundant supply, prices are down. You might want to send it to Port Harcourt, or you might want to send it to Enugu. These are other markets in the south that also may provide you a good price. And then they also provide the farmers with training on not only agricultural practices for tomato production, but also ways of packing their tomatoes so that they maximize the benefit of using the crates. So what is the potential? Again, can this kind of a model that provides the access to the service, but then also provides access to the crates, but then also a guaranteed market that can allow the farmer to already make a determination of if it's profitable for them to use the crates, can these kinds of models be expanded to increase the adoption of these crates? And or can we also do other innovations with this kind of an actor where they already have a network of partners to increase the adoption of other practices that can reduce post-harvest loss? And so I'm just going to end now with some important questions or knowledge gaps that I think remain, where and which I think are particularly important in the case of having inclusive value chains. So the first is understanding what determines how inclusive the current models or innovations that these MSMEs are using are, and how that varies with the scale of the MSME, the value chain of concern, and their level of formalization. The other issue is understanding what the mechanisms through which understanding better the mechanisms through which the provision of this suite of services actually translates into improved welfare or outcomes for the partners of these MSMEs. What I mean is that if they're providing this suite of services and it comes at a cost, is the whole suite of services necessary, or are there certain elements of that suite of services that are really critical that then you can actually have a similar outcome but with a lower cost? So understanding these will also enable us to understand the trade-offs from the kinds of models that they're using and understand how this could potentially be offered at a lower cost. Another thing is also determining what elements of the current models that they are using are working well and which aren't working well. Sometimes they might have scalable interventions that just need to be tweaked. But if we aren't studying them, then we just think that they're a failure and then we move on because sometimes they change a lot. And the last thing is also understanding better through rigorous research, working with these MSMEs, how these MSMEs can be a mechanism to then make the value chains operate in more inclusive ways or ways that can enable us to have the outcomes that we're particularly interested in. And so with that, I just want to conclude that these MSMEs in the midstream and downstream of food value chains, and actually all across value chains, are already a very important source of livelihood for many in developing countries. Many of them are already innovating, and they're innovating in ways that can make the food systems to be more inclusive. Doesn't mean that they don't have challenges. There are lots of challenges with these MSMEs, and that's been documented in the literature. But many of their innovations have potential or are working, but just haven't been rigorously tested. I think that it's really important when we're trying to talk about programs for bundling or innovations that we create space to learn better what is already happening on the ground, what innovations are already being introduced and used by actors in the space who are going to be there long after our intervention, and see if we can start from there to learn how to better design policies, programs, and interventions to support them to deliver on desired outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Soeda. Very compelling. So we have time for questions and answers. I hope you've understood and recognized that what we've been hearing here is very much the bridge between the A and the NH, right? It's what goes on between A and NH, and it's often neglected. It's often been called the missing middle, both in terms of research and in terms of policy focus and even donor attention. So unfortunately,
well, thank you.
we're going to have to come to a close. So I'm going to hand it back to Shabani, who's going to invite closing comments.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for such a fabulous session and quite great questions. And I'm going to ask Ahmed Kablan to come up to give closing remarks.
Thank you, Shibani, and thanks for speakers, Sweda, Shibani, Giacomo, Patrick, and Jocelyn. Very exciting, very interesting presentations, and also highlight the problem at hand. And apologies in advance, I have to read from my phone. I'm not as smart as they are, so I don't remember my comments. Food loss and waste, as have been highlighted, is a handicap in the agri-food system. And according to FAO, it contributes to a great amount of food that's been wasted, enough to feed 1.2 billion individuals for 2 years, or the value of $1 trillion annually. Putting it in Malawi context, 25% of all food produced is lost at the production and the post-harvest stage. In addition to that, there is 103 kilograms of food being wasted in Malawi per individual per year. Just think about these numbers. That accounts to 22% of the total water used in agriculture being lost, and up to 70% of cropland used in Malawi is being lost for food loss and waste. Dalton and food loss and waste also, as Jocelyn and Sweden and others indicated, it is an underinvested sector. We don't have a unified definition or a harmonized methodology for collecting it. Dalton and Fugli, for example, they looked at US aid investment in agriculture research and how much of that share goes to production and different sectors. About 5% only from that goes toward post-harvest losses only, not food loss and waste, just post-harvest loss. Transforming agriculture food system toward a sustainable and resilient food systems require policy actions. And as Patrick indicated, that take into account the producers, the consumers, and everything and everyone in between. FAO modeling of recent publication on the food system sustainable food system transformation indicate that ending hunger at 5% level is possible by 2030, but that requires these policy actions ranging from safety net, school feeding, repurposing farm subsidies, consumer intervention reform, reducing food loss and waste, innovation, technologies, knowledge for farmers. The cost of these packages was estimated at 8% of the global food market, and the Africa share of that cost is about 30%. The trade-off for implementing these different policy actions ranging from positive to negative and the cost for it, the only one intervention that came at all of their modeling as a negative, in other words, improvement, was reducing food loss and waste in terms of land use, water, and climate actions. We need private sector from medium, small, and large enterprises to take their part and to act. But in order to enable African and beyond private sector, we need an enabling environment, policies that support private sector and that support investing and financing at low interest rate. We can't really expect private sector to reform when they have financing rate at 30 or 40% APR. A recent analysis by WRI showed that for businesses, for every $1 they invest in food loss and waste reduction, their return on investment was $14 US, with 70% return in the first year and 95% return on the second year. At Feed the Future, we are co-investing with the private sectors, with small and medium enterprises, and the first wave of investment happened to be in Kenya and Tanzania. That will be announced soon, hopefully. This grant focus on supporting this private sector, or either on establishing new product line to package product marketed that otherwise will end up to be wasted, or looking at composting and other intervention to manage food waste. Finally, food loss and waste contribute to 10% greenhouse gas emissions. I want to reflect on the movie screening that we saw last night. 50% or about 50% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from food loss and waste. If it was a country, if it was the third country after US and China. So you need also to target food loss and waste in addition to the US and China and food emissions or in emission. And also for all of us, a word, when we are thinking about eating or consuming or our fridge, think 10 times before you're leaving any food in your plates. Think about Anitas and the million Anitas out there who are feeling the impact of climate change on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed, for really reminding us the importance of reducing food loss and waste. So with that, I'm going to close this session. Thank you all for being a fabulous audience, and please feel free to reach out to all our speakers and panelists if you would like to have separate discussions. Thanks. Bye.